Welcome back to Fresh Outlook, everybody. The death of Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia left behind a court divided, and that divided court could leave standing an unfavorable ruling to the Obama administration, a ruling that unravels his efforts to grant virtual amnesty to 4 million people who entered the United States illegally. I am joined once again by Bill Rosenberg, Jackie Guzda, and Albert Golson. Albert, take a look in your crystal ball. What do you think the Supreme Court's going to do?
Well, I think they're going to just push it off until the next administration. At this point, the Republicans are trying very hard to make sure that this doesn't go through. They've had enough losses as far as legislative battles are concerned, and I believe that they're hopeful for, let's say, the new Republican candidate, whoever he may be, that they can actually put through their particular program, which is possibly the deportation of up to 4 million citizens who are undocumented.
Right. Bill, explain the legal crux or the legal battle that the Supreme Court is looking at. Basically, President Obama said that the people who have legal children in this country can stay and work, right?
Right. Well, it's actually very complicated when you think about it. First of all, there's the whole principle about how you get citizenship in the United States, and we have what's called birthright citizenship. So if you're born in the United States, it doesn't matter where your parents are from, what country they're a citizen of, you have citizenship. And the issue that's been broiling for a little while is that if a woman comes to the United States and then she has a baby, that baby is an American citizen, the mother is not. So theoretically, you could deport the mother and allow the child to stay. And in some cases, that's happened where maybe the child is taken by an aunt or a cousin and can remain in the United States, but it separates families, which is a policy which most Americans really do not favor. So the question is, what are we going to do about this? Well,
Or the whole family could just go back to the
whole family could go back,
country,
and conservatives would like that to be the case, where you go back to whatever country you were, and when the person becomes 18, they could come back to the United States and they could apply for financial aid to go to American universities and everything else because they're a citizen. The point, though, that I think also obscures this whole debate is the way this has come about in this particular case. This is an executive order that was issued by President Obama. He issued an executive order largely, I believe, because Congress wouldn't act, okay, that they couldn't come to some kind of conclusion. And he was basically tired of trying to get something. The Republicans say they couldn't get something because he wouldn't negotiate fairly with it. So there's where your politics comes in. Ultimately, though, a lower court ruling supported the position that what Obama was asking for was not constitutional. And as a result, the Supreme Court now gets to hear this case on appeal. If it's a 4-4 vote, the lower court ruling stands. The problem for conservatives, though, is that there are actually more liberal courts across the United States in the federal court system now than there are conservative courts. So every time there's one of these 4-4 cases, it may be that the Democratic or more progressive side is going to win because there's not a fifth vote to go against them. So there's a kind of a cat and mouse game, although this is a major issue and really should be solved by having another Supreme Court justice on the bench to be able to make a deciding vote.
Jackie, let's turn it back a little bit to immigration right now. Bill brings up the point that President Obama felt frustrated, so he issued an executive order. But from watching how a bill becomes a law as a kid on Schoolhouse Rocks, that's not how a bill becomes a law. It's not how laws are enacted. This is not a dictator of the United States who rules by fiat. He's supposed to sign legislation into law. So perhaps what the president did, although it might have been well intended, was illegal.
Well, that's for the court to decide. That's why we have 3 branches of government. But he kept saying to Congress, bring me a bill.
Doesn't matter.
Bring me a bill. No, I understand that. But he was saying, let's get this done. They had the Gang of 8. Nothing got done.
Right.
So.
But again, I don't want to sound like Trump, but doesn't matter. I sound like I'm 5 years old, but, you know.
That's right. That's right. But number one, I don't think it's a good idea to say this fellow is a dictator because he's only done 170 executive orders in comparison to someone like Bush or, any of the presidents who run about 300. So he's much less. And number two, he pushed it and now we're going to let the courts decide which is legal.
The other thing is that this isn't a law that Obama passed. This is an executive order.
Right.
That executive order ends the day Barack Obama leaves the presidency, January 20th, which is different than the Schoolhouse Rocks, which is a simplified version of a law that stays on the books forever until it's repealed. This is a limited duration executive order and will disappear unless the new president, if it would be either Clinton or Trump, comes in and says, we want to extend it, or Congress passes a law.
All right, but it has the effect of law, Albert, so that's part of the problem. The other problem that Jackie brings up is that perhaps Obama has made fewer executive orders, but he's made much broader, more sweeping executive orders, where other presidents in the past have made executive orders to simply clarify legislation that's already on the books.
Well, that's true. So, it's really contingent on the type of executive orders that he has issued. And most of them are, of course, very, very political, very high visibility. And given the current atmosphere compared to previous administrations, you have an extremely polarized political environment in which both sides are really digging in their heels, and they're not even talking, not even communicating. So when President Obama, insisted, let's get this thing going, nobody even wanted to have a discussion or a talk, formal or informally, concerning this matter. So this really brings things to a head, makes things very political, highly polarized, and it brings up all these sort of controversies.
Yeah, the other thing that I would add is that the Supreme Court, whether we want to recognize it or not, is a political institution. If we get a more progressive person on the court, then the decisions are going to go more progressive in general. They're not going to go more conservative. That's number one. Number two, that one of the things that's also not really in the conversation but should be is if we go back, for example, to the Bush administration, George W. Bush, he issued what were called signing statements. He signed pieces of legislation knowing that he was never going to enforce them, and wrote a statement which did not get publicly released. It says, we're not going to do Article 2, Section 3. So even though there's a law in the books, and even though it may say something, that was a sort of a subterfuge that was actually taking place, and George W. Bush did this more than anyone else. He didn't really veto pieces of legislation. He basically accepted legislation and then said, I'm not going to do what the legislation says. So if on the one hand you want to go after Obama for putting out an executive order, he's making a clear statement about what the terms are going to be during his term. Bush, on the other hand, didn't do that. He issued signing statements which never really became so public, and as a result, the law that was passed by Congress, the Schoolhouse Rock version, never really got in place either.
Thank God for Schoolhouse Rock, I would do nothing. Jackie, let me talk to you a little bit about fairness. You have a country that allowed people to flood over the border. You had people overstay their visas. You didn't enforce the laws. You had them build lives here. You had them set up homes here. You had them set up children here. If you're not enforcing the law and you become an attractive nuisance where people are drawn to the country, at this point, it's abhorrent to say, now you got to get out of here.
Isn't that crazy?
Right?
Yeah, that's absolutely crazy. There was a quote from Anthony Bourdain, and he said, every restaurant in America would feel this financially or go under, because you have all these undocumented immigrants keeping restaurants afloat. They're doing the jobs that nobody wants to do. They're in those hot kitchens until 2 a.m. You've got people picking oranges over here. I mean, all of these fear tactics, well, they're going to take away your jobs and this and that. Guess what? Nobody wants those jobs.
Your lawns would be really high also.
Yeah.
Let's get Albert in on
California.
the conversation. Albert, part of the problem is these folks are willing to work for lower wages. I think you would have Americans who have been longtime citizens in this country willing to mow lawns, willing to paint, willing to work in kitchens if they were given a better wage. So in some ways, we're depressing the wages by having undocumented immigrants fill these roles or these jobs that people say are unwanted. You have a lot of people on welfare, a lot of people on unemployment, a lot of people on disability who should be working.
Well, as Jackie mentioned, again, these are very undesirable jobs. And even if you raise the minimum wage, there are quite a number of people who'll say, look, that sounds great, I'll get more money, but I really don't want to go into these type of jobs, because in most cases, those jobs themselves don't necessarily lead to higher positions. If you are in, for example, working for some sort of a corporation, established company or a government, there's a possibility that, or actually the possibility that you would get advancement within that organization. If you're working in a hot kitchen, in a dive bar, what have you, well, where would you go? You really would have to pool money together to start your own place. So these aren't places, as Jackie mentioned, that you would actually get a greater education as far as business is concerned. So they wouldn't attract that many Americans to those positions, even if you raised to a higher minimum wage or even beyond that.
Bill, does this point to a collusion between government, business, and the illegal immigrant industry in this country?
Well, I would say that I'd ask people to think about who are the people that are in favor of a minimum wage of $15 an hour. Okay, and you look at those individuals in public service and think about the fact that they're also the ones that want to have more open immigration. And the people that don't want to have open immigration, that want to build a big wall and put more blockades and deport people, are the ones that are opposed to minimum wage. So if the argument has to do with salaries and money and people taking the jobs, maybe an alternative would be for conservative folks to stand up and back a minimum wage that goes to $15 an hour. They're not willing to do that, though, right?
Good point. Of course they're not, but they probably will, because that looks like where the country's headed state by state anyway. Bill Rosenberg, Jackie Guzda, Albert Gulson, thanks so much for your time. We'll have more with them and a whole lot more fresh outlook straight ahead. The makers of the most popular operating system in the world face scrutiny in the European Union. More on that after this.